Hi everyone, my name is Chris and this is my presentation on call ID spoofing and scams. This is an overview of what this presentation will be covering. Firstly, I'm going to discuss what call ID spoofing is and the call ID spoofing techniques used. Then I will be discussing what's causing the rise in call ID spoofing. I will then explain how call ID spoofing works, why scammers are using call ID spoofing. I'll then go through some examples of case studies, analyze some statistics on scams, and finally some protection measures on how you can protect yourself against call ID spoofing. What is caller ID spoofing? Simply put, caller ID spoofing is altering the caller ID sent out when making a call, and the person receiving the call will see the altered number displayed on their phone. As you can see in the diagram, the incoming call shows the altered number displayed, and it's very difficult to identify if the incoming call has been spoofed. Businesses have valid reasons to use caller ID spoofing. For example, contractors working for a company making a call to a customer would spoof their number to show the company's advertised number. However, scammers use caller ID spoofing for malicious purposes. Now that call ID spoofing has been explained, I will move on to the rise of call ID spoofing. In recent years, call ID spoofing has risen as voice over IP has evolved, otherwise known as VoIP. Before VoIP was around, call routing and spoofing required a high level of understanding of telephony exchange and equipment, which was expensive to run and maintain. In addition, roaming costs were expensive when calls were made from overseas. The evolution of VoIP has made it easy to use apps and services over the internet to spoof a call without having a complex understanding of telephony exchange, and due to this, using VoIP eliminates roaming costs, making it easy and inexpensive to run and maintain. This slide will explain how call ID spoofing works over VoIP. As VoIP allows for phone calls to be made over the internet, there are many different spoofing providers and mobile apps that allow a user to configure a phone number before making a call. Once configured, scammers can use different spoofing techniques to run their scams. They can spoof legitimate organizations, businesses, governments, and institutions, or they can use neighbor spoofing. These techniques will be discussed later on. Furthermore, spoofing expands beyond phone calls, including SMS and text messages, email addresses, and GPS locations. However, this presentation only covers call ID spoofing. Here is an example of how spoofing service providers work. Spoofing service providers are generally paid services which require an account, and they offer support just like any other app. Once the account is set up, the user would use the provider's software or web interface to place a spoofed call. In this diagram, the scammer is making a call from their PC using the spoofing software which has been configured as a bank's phone number. The call goes through the spoofing service provider to the receiver, and the receiver will see the bank's phone number displayed on their phone. The next example shows how someone could use a mobile app to make a spoofed phone call. Similar to the previous example, the app is a paid service which a user requires an account. There are, however, some mobile apps that allow free limited use. The diagram here shows how the caller could use a mobile phone app to configure a number of a legitimate bank, and the receiver of the call would see the bank's number displayed. I will now move on to why scammers use call ID spoofing. Firstly, scammers know that the likelihood of answering a call from a private or unknown number is low. Using call ID spoofing would increase the chances of someone answering if the phone call appears to be coming from a business or organization or from the same country or area code. Now that there is a higher chance of the call being answered, the scammers can start to collect your personal information, which, if enough information is collected, can be used for identity theft. Scammers can also use call ID spoofing to make threatening calls and demand money. And lastly, scammers can also benefit financially if more calls are answered from spoofed phone calls. Previous slide covered why scammers use call ID spoofing, and the next two slides will cover why scammers spoof businesses, organizations, and use neighbor spoofing. Scammers use automated recordings along with caller ID spoofing to spoof organizations such as banks. They could use tactics such as convincing the caller that they are in legal trouble or fraudulent transactions have occurred. If the caller falls for the trap, the scammers can then start to earn the caller's trust to benefit financially. Scammers can also use tactics such as neighbor spoofing. Neighbor spoofing is when someone spoofs their number to display as a number that is similar to the number that they are calling, also known as adjacent number. To help understand the concept of neighbor spoofing, the diagram shows the scammer made a spoofed call with the last two digits as 42, and they called the same number but the last digit is different. In this case, the last digit is 1. Scammers would use neighbor spoofing as people will be more likely to answer a call from a similar number. Scammers can also use robot calling with neighbor spoofing. This tactic can be used to validate the number that they are calling is a valid number. I will now go through some spoofed call ID example cases. I will start by firstly providing an example of spoofing a police station and secondly an example of neighbor spoofing. Here is an example of where a scammer has spoofed a local police station. In this example, the scammer first started as a robot call where the victim answered the call and dialed the key on the keypad as instructed. The call then transferred to scammer 1 who collected some details from the victim. Not long after, scammer 2 from the same organization called the victim spoofing the local police station. Here scammer 2 convinced the victim that the victim was involved in money laundering and fraud and would need to pay large amounts of money for the victim's name to be cleared. Since scammer 2 was so convincing and earned the victim's trust, the victim arranged to withdraw the money and hand the money to a money mule who sent the money overseas to the scammers. Because the scammers used a local police station caller ID and a convincing story, the victim lost money and the scammers benefited financially. The next example shows how neighbor spoofing is used with robot calls to validate numbers. Here the scammers have a robot system set up to dial numbers in a specific area and spoof the number that belongs to someone living in that area. Multiple people receive calls from the same spoofed number that disconnects after being answered, and they can receive multiple calls a day. The people who receive this call sometimes call the number back, and because the number belongs to someone in that area, the person who owns that number receives multiple calls and sometimes threatening calls. The victim receiving calls from different people that originated from the scammer's spoofed calls would need to report the issue to their police or their provider and may need to consider changing their number. This issue caused by neighbor spoofing is an example where the victim can be subject to harassment and threats. Now that call ID spoofing has been covered, the next few slides will provide some scam statistics in Australia. These statistics will provide an analysis on spoofing scams and financial loss. I will now go through analysing some statistics relating to scams in Australia within the last 2 years. Scammers can pose as charities, service providers, banks and health organisations in order to benefit financially. According to the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, also referred to as the ACCC, in 2022, the ACCC recorded about 560,000 reports that were made by individuals who had received a scam or were a victim of a scam. In addition, organizations reported a combined total loss of about $1.8 billion. However, a third of scams were unreported, and it is estimated that over $2 billion was lost due to scams. The ACCC also saw that women had reported more scams than men, but men had lost more money than women. Comparing the stats from 2022, the ACCC reports that in 2023 there was about 239,000 reports that were made, but the financial loss was higher, equating to about $3.1 billion. The ACCC also reported that there was about 16.5% reduction in reported scams since 2021, and the individual loss was about 50% higher. Here is a brief breakdown of two different types of scams and the financial loss between 2021 and 2022, which was recorded by the ACCC. Here you can see that in 2022 the financial loss for investment scams was about $1.5 billion, which was significantly higher compared to 2021, which was only about $701 million. Payment redirection scams in 2022 saw a financial loss of $227 million compared to $224 million in 2021. I will now move on to protection against call ID spoofing. This will cover what organizations, institutions, and the government are doing to help protect against call ID spoofing, and how you can be aware and self-protect against call ID spoofing. What organizations, institutions, and the government are doing to help protect against spoofed call scams. Telecommunication providers are actively blocking identified and known spoofed numbers. This means that calls and text messages that have been blocked will never reach their customers. Financial institutions are also working with telecommunication providers to help combat against spoofing by using a Do Not Originate list. This is a list that is maintained where the numbers on that list are for inbound calls only, and outbound calls are blocked by the telecommunication providers. This means that the bank's customers can call the bank's inbound number, but if a spoofer was to use one of the numbers on that list, the call will be blocked from a network level. Governments have services available such as ScamWatch in Australia, where individuals can report spoofing and other scams. These services can provide support for individuals affected by spoofing and other scams. It is important to be aware when receiving calls from a number that could be spoofed. It is important to note that organizations and financial institutions will never call and ask you to confirm financial and personal details, including any login and password details. In addition, institutions and services will never use automated recordings telling you that your services will be disconnected or that you are in legal trouble. With that said, being aware is an effective method of protecting yourself from scams and financial loss. When receiving a call from a scammer using a spoofed phone number, you could take the following measures to protect yourself. End the call. End the call by tapping the End Call button or hanging up the phone. Do not reply or call the number back. Doing so could mean that you are just validating that your number is active to the scammers, and you could receive more calls. Blocking the call on your phone. This will prevent the scammers from calling you again using the same spoofed number. Call your bank or service provider to report the call if you suspect that your details have been compromised. Do not transfer any money. Never trust a caller who is asking you to transfer money. Organizations and institutions will never ask you to transfer any money. Report the call. If you have any concerns or if your details have been compromised, contact or report the scam to the appropriate authorities. Remember to always be vigilant when receiving calls and messages from unrecognized numbers. That concludes this presentation. Thanks for watching. A reference list is listed in the description of this video. Please click or tap the like and subscribe buttons, and please share with your family and friends to raise awareness against call ID spoofing and scams.